Welcome everyone. Welcome to this week's 20-minute tech break. Scott, Dustin, thanks so much for joining us too as today's speakers. So this week we're going to be focusing on a part 2 of last week's conversation around starting your cloud journey. So this week we're going to be focusing on lift and shift migration, tying really well with last week's conversation around application modernization. So I know Scott and Dustin are really excited to be sharing some info and answering some questions that you have around this topic. Scott Weber, he's our VP of Cloud Solutions, and Dustin Potter is our Senior Cloud Solutions Architect. So I think they will have some great insight into whatever questions you might have around the topic. If this is your first 20-minute tech break and joining us, welcome. And the way that today's going to flow is we prepared 4 different topics for discussion, questions on the next slide. So Scott and Dustin will go through those, and then we'll open it up to questions from you. So we really would love to hear from you. If there's anything that you're wondering, feel free to put it in the chat box. Or when it comes to the Q&A portion, you can raise your hand using the Ring Central controls, and we'll call on you and you can ask your question. Okay, Scott and Dustin, take it away.
Thank you very much, Courtney. Yeah, continuing our talks about moving into the cloud like we were doing last week with Scott and Andrew. We're really focusing more on just the migration portion, not so much the software portion. So the first question that comes up here is, what are the common ways to get to the cloud? I know that we often talk about whether it's lift and shift, re-platform, re-architect. What's the explanation behind some of those, Scott?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Dustin, and we're excited again that everybody's tuned in today. So I use the term lift and shift pretty broadly. If we think back to last week, if anybody saw last week's when we were talking to Andrew about application modernization, in that scenario, we're really saying it's almost a do-over. We're going to look at that application code, tear it apart, rewrite it, get you into that cloud native architecture. When I think of lift and shift, though, this can fall into a couple derivations of that term. Purely lift and shift, on a pure definition, would be a one-to-one migration of your virtual machines or physical machines in your data center up to AWS. But I also include in the lift and shift category this idea of maybe lift and shift re-architect, where we might do some things to make the system more reliable with some of the features that the cloud can give us. Or we might look at moving to some other services in the cloud, maybe databases. But we'll dive into that a little bit more into the particulars of each of those in a little bit.
Yeah, I think usually when I think of lift and shift, the one thing that's usually out of the question is changes in the underlying technology. So if it's written in one language, you're probably not moving to another language. You're taking the existing application, maybe changing some of the things that are around it that you can leverage AWS for a little bit more. So, and that kind of leads into the second question, which is, when is lift and shift the right option? How should we determine if we should re-platform, if we should re-architect, or if we should lift and shift with a little bit of extra stuff? Is there usually a cut and dry answer for that?
For some systems, yes, it can be pretty cut and dried. Sometimes, though, we need to apply some modeling, financial modeling around the decision. The ones that you see that are the easy decision for a lift and shift are those third-party software packages that might have been purchased. So that could be something like an SAP. You're going to lift and shift an SAP environment, right? You might change it a little bit to run better in AWS, but probably it's a lift and shift, right? So, third party being where you've bought like an off-the-shelf piece of software, you don't have access to the underlying source code. You're not going to be able to change the database platform that it's running on. You're locked into what that vendor says that you're going to do. So that's one area where lift and shift is the right option. That's the easier decision usually. Then you get into like the discussion about some of these systems of, what would be the return on investment if we made changes to it? And is there enough return to try to modernize it? Or quite frankly, is it a legacy system that its lifespan may only be the next couple of years, but you still need to get it out of the data center and into the cloud? That's where lift and shift is also going to make sense, where it just, you don't want to spend the money, even if you had the source code to start to modernize that application. The other thing that can fall into this category is the applications that are what we would call fragile. And it could be that you don't have the developers on staff anymore for it. You know, it has again, those are usually short lifetime type applications as well. But fragility of the application can play into the decision of how you're going to make the move as well.
And I like thinking about that too, because it also leads into why you might want to just lift and shift to AWS in the first place. There's so much, especially when you kind of have a system like that where it's either fragile or it's just a black box. You don't have control of the underlying software. You know, there's so much monitoring and tooling that AWS gives you that you can monitor that from the outside in and give you better introspective into, you know, when something is going wrong, so that you can scale, tear things down, remediate issues on something that you don't have the choice to actually go in and fix.
Yeah, definitely. And so you know, these are things that we help our customers figure out, you know, how are you going to make that move?
Yep. You know, so the third question here is, you know, what are the approaches to lift and shift? What are our options within that small realm? I know we've kind of alluded to it a little bit, Scott.
Yeah, so there's a couple. You know, if we want to do just that straight, just one for one type move, there's tools and technologies from AWS. One of the best that we have a lot of experience with using is a tool called Cloud Endure. AWS actually bought this company about 1.5 years ago. Agent-based, you install the agent on the VM and it does a constant disk level copy, block copy up into the cloud. So that's really for a nice use case of the one-to-one. You can use it on any type of system, Windows, Linux, doesn't matter the software running on that system. We've done things as complicated as IBM MQ systems running on top of Windows using Cloud Endure to image the server across. Nice thing about this approach, very low downtime when you actually want to make the cutover. Stop the server on-prem, make sure that the copy is consistent, and you can turn that server on in the cloud, and you're up and running now in the cloud. Other approach, and we can do that for databases running on VMs. Maybe if we're moving those like one for one to VMs database running on VMs in AWS. The other types of options around lift and shift is now, do we want to introduce something new? Maybe you're running Windows 2012, or you know, maybe you still have some legacy 2008 on-prem. We can't run Windows 2008 in AWS anymore. Maybe you want to get modern to 2016 for that system. In that case, we're going to spin up new servers in AWS and reinstall the application on top of that new OS. With databases, you have the choice of, do I want to continue to run databases on virtual machines, or do I want to go and leverage some of the platform services that AWS has to offer around the relational database service? Maybe I want to stay on an Oracle, but I don't want to have Oracle licensing issues anymore. I want to get to a platform service from AWS. We recently helped a customer do this as well. Or SQL Server, same thing. I want to get to a platform service. I don't want my DBAs worrying about disk space and tuning of hardware and virtual machines anymore. I want them to focus on data modeling. So then when you start to look at, okay, how do I migrate that database? There's tools like Database Migration Service to help make those types of moves. We can do things as simple as backups and restores actually work really well. Now, you have to plan for an outage usually when that happens. If you're very outage sensitive in your system, you may take a more automated system like Database Migration Service. And then the other thing that we do with some of these is, can we make the applications more robust by getting them into the cloud? We have a case study for one of our customers where we did this. Their application was fragile in the data center, had multiple single points of failure, but by moving them into AWS, it was I call it a like for like move. It was the same OSs. We used Cloud Endure on some of the servers, but we moved the databases to redundant, master slave databases in RDS, but we were able to bring load balancers to the table with multiple front-end servers to give a high availability at that tier, because downtime was incredibly critical for this application, and they couldn't achieve these things in their data center.
You said plenty there, Scott. A lot to cover on that front. And all these things, it's interesting to go through figuring out how or what is the best strategy, because it can come down to as simple as, we would rather be in charge of the backup strategy, or we don't want to use, DMS for some reason. or it could come down to a feature set. Maybe there's just something not supported on, the platform services that you absolutely need. And that's fine. Sometimes it happens. But usually, we find that we can always work around those issues. We can always find approaches that will, maybe offload that to something else that we can still utilize some of the scaling capabilities that AWS provides.
Yeah, definitely.
And then finally, so how can I get started? What is the path forward with figuring out what the right option is in terms of migrating to the cloud?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a really good blog post from several years ago that sort of set the stage on how I think almost everybody approaches cloud migrations today. And it came from AWS, and it talks about this concept of 6 R's. And what it really is the way to get started is look at your inventory of systems and start to ask yourself questions like, am I going to retain that environment, and is it going to stay on premise for some reason? If you're running AS400, you're not moving that to the cloud, right? So that's going to stay. So you start to classify the systems that you have, looking at, am I going to retain it on premise? Am I going to retire it? Am I going to take some of those services that I might be running on premise and look for us, does that provider of that software now have like a SaaS option where I can get completely out of the business of running that system and just pay a monthly fee for them to run it for me? Then you get down to, what do you have left? And now you start to say, am I going to re-platform this as a move? And once you start to do that classification, that's usually step one for getting started and understanding of migration. Cost also is a big thing with migrations. We have the ability, working with AWS, we've done this for multiple customers now, where we can actually do a full licensing and TCO analysis for you for free, using tools like Cloud Chomp and Cloud Checker to help you understand, what is your cost to operate today? What is going to be your cost to operate tomorrow inside the cloud? Because cost is always something you want to understand heading into these types of projects. And then, start to play around. Try out Cloud Endure. Try the server migration service. And just take something small. See if you can get it across. See if it works on the other side once it's up in the cloud.
Yeah, that's the really the beauty of AWS to me, is that it affords you that ability to experiment. It's pay as you go. There's no commitment. If something doesn't work, great. You learn something about that. You can move on, apply what you learned to the next strategy. So always plenty of opportunities there.
Yeah, definitely.
So then, that's really the 4 main questions that we had to cover today. What is there anything else, that people have that they, is on their minds about migrating to the cloud?
Yeah, so feel free, if you would like to put any questions in the chat box, you're welcome to, or if you'd like, feel free to raise your hand and we can chat with Dustin and Scott. Okay. Couple questions coming in. One question from Jessica. Can you provide an example of where you performed a lift and shift migration for a customer?
Oh, plenty. I don't know. What's your favorite, Scott?
Well, I think one that, really resonates with the idea of lift and shift, but improving the architecture. And we have the case study for it up on our website, is Worldwide Flight. This was a mission critical system, Windows-based, IBM MQ, very specific networking requirements, and truly a mission critical system. If this system goes down, airplanes don't leave JFK Airport. So we were able to work with the customer, successfully migrate them. I think they had a 2-hour outage window during the migration and cutover into AWS. And you can learn more at the case study at our website.
Another question from Wendy. Have you worked with any customers for whom a lift and shift was not recommended, and why?
Dustin, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Not recommended. So yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those questions where it's like, yes, you could do a lift and shift, but the benefits of going another route are going to be much higher compared to just doing a simple lift and shift. So, I think that Cognizant is the biggest one that comes to mind on that. we found that actually, doing a full application build for them, from the ground up requirements, doing a fully serverless environment using Lambda, API Gateway, CloudFront was really the best option here. It allowed us to modernize the system. It allowed us to get all the benefits of serverless, all the scalability. It allowed us to reduce all the management overhead, again, because you're going serverless. And when you looked at the effort to lift and shift compared to the effort to rewrite and the benefits that you'd get out of that, it really was the better option.
Awesome. Thank you for those questions. And I know we have a few folks that are just joining us on the phone. Would be happy to welcome you to unmute if you have any other questions. And if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box. All right, Chris, I see you. The floor is yours.
Hi, Dustin and Scott. Wanted to ask you, what are some of the considerations for like large scale servers, like half a terabyte, a terabyte on lifting and shifting onto the AWS cloud? Is that like getting a high speed internet connection, or do you recommend getting a snowball? How do you determine that?
So Chris, that's a great question. And there's a couple things that we look at in that. First, we want to know what is the data that's on that server. So in other words, is it a database server that just has large databases? Is it image files? What is the role of that server? For instance, we've been working with a customer here recently. They had 30 terabytes of image data setting on their SAN for one piece of their architecture, and they had another 6 terabytes in a file storage area that was predominantly PDF. For a workload like that, using something like a snowball is actually a preferred way of doing it, because they're just image files that we're just going to copy off one machine, put it onto the snowball, ship it to AWS. AWS can put it on S3, and then once it's to S3, it's quite fast once we're inside the AWS fabric that we could pull those files back to either a hosted file system inside AWS, something like FSX for Windows, or the Elastic file system if we're doing things in Linux, and then we can recreate, what that application is maybe expecting for how to interact with those files. If this were database servers, that's where something like a DMS or setting up even just native replication support. So if it's SQL Server, just setting up, T-log shipping, basically take a backup, restore the backup in the AWS, and then set up T-log shipping, log shipping off of the SQL servers up to the SQL server in AWS, and just sort of use native replication to, keep the database in the cloud synced with what's going on premise. There's other tools like data sync from AWS that can help us synchronize these drives. Believe it or not, though, something even like Cloud Endure can manage, a half a terabyte, even a terabyte size disk, because again, Cloud Endure is just doing a block level copy. So once the initial copy is done, now it's just writing the Delta blocks in real time that go up. So you may have a little bit of delay initially to get the first replication up, the first copy up, but then after that, you're just writing the changed blocks. So keeping that in sync long term isn't a big deal. At some point in time, if security is an issue, if you really want dedicated bandwidth, then we can have a discussion about a direct connect circuit, either a 1 or a 10 gig direct connect circuit, depending upon the needs. That gives you dedicated, low latency to AWS, guaranteed bandwidth and security, because now it's that piece of fiber is your piece of fiber from your edge router to the edge of the AWS global network, and then routed into your AWS accounts. So we have to do a little bit of analysis of what is on those machines, what's on those drives. A lot of times too, what we'll find is customer says they've got a terabyte drive attached to a server, but how much is actually in utilization, right? That's a very common thing that somebody requests a terabyte, but maybe they're only using a quarter of it. So maybe the problem isn't as bad as we think it is. So we typically want to do that type of due diligence, and then pull out the right tool out of the tool belt to get that data migrated.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Chris, for the question. Any other questions before we finish up today? Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining in on the conversation today. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Dustin, for your insight. And we'll be back here Friday at 12:30 next week. Next week's topic is going to be a little different. We're going to be chatting about data-driven marketing. So looking at industry trends, customer trends. So if you're interested, let us know and we will send you an email out for next week. Thanks everyone for joining us.